At 6:29 a.m. on October the 7th, 2023, several thousand members of the proscribed Hamas terrorist group broke through the Israel border fence in more than 50 places. Their weapons were guns, missiles and grenades, and their main targets were small kibbutzes. 150 of the attackers targeted the Nir Oz kibbutz, killing or kidnapping a quarter of its residents. Another main target was the Nova Music Festival, where 364 people were murdered and many others taken hostage. In all, 1,200 civilians were killed in these attacks and 5,000 people injured. Dozens of the women and girls who were killed were sexually assaulted and mutilated before and after death. In total, 251 hostages were kidnapped and taken to Gaza. In the aftermath of these atrocities, I noticed that two things started to happen. First, incidents of anti-Semitic attacks and abuse in the UK rose by 105% in the first half of 2024, the highest ever reported total. Second, some of my Jewish friends began to send me private messages, thanking me for using my Facebook page to do what all decent non-Jews should do, namely, to stand with them and to speak out against the atrocities and all incidents of anti-Semitism. One of them said, "Anti-Semitism is a light sleeper. I fear it's becoming an insomniac." I soon realised that in my capacity as a writer and filmmaker, some sort of greater response was both required and inevitable. And I also realised it wasn't enough to respond merely by sitting in my office, relying on what I thought I knew about the history of anti-Semitism to create an artistic response. Sometimes, as an artist, you have to literally walk through the gates of hell to find the truth and authenticity necessary for your work that you can't get through books, articles and online sources. So, in September 2024, that's what I did. I took myself to Krakow for a week to see the remains of hell on earth. This film, made on just £1,000 of crowdfunding, is the result. Although it was recent horrific events which provoked me to make this film, in fact, its genesis goes back more than 50 years, when I was 11, and challenged the anti-Semitism expressed towards the wonderful Jewish girl who was my best friend for over a decade, and one of the most important and influential people in my life. Dawn had befriended me at middle school. She chose me to be her friend out of everyone else in the school, and that was a big thing for me. I so wanted to be more like her. She was worldly, mature beyond her years, happy-go-lucky, and a talented self-taught guitarist whose musical tastes, Van Morrison, Lou Reed, Joni Mitchell, opened my ears. What was not to like? Well, my friends at school found something to dislike. When Dawn and I became friends, their reaction was, "What do you want to go around with that Jewish girl for?" That was as incomprehensible to me then as it is now. I've kept all the letters and postcards sent to me by this dear friend, and one of them is a postcard dated September the 7th, 1984, sent from Krakow. Its image was the main market square in the city centre. Exactly 40 years later, on that very date, I was standing in that same place, starting work on this film. The first time I ever went to mainland Europe was in the spring of 1980, a weekend in Amsterdam. I was only there for the weekend, but felt compelled to visit the Anne Frank house on Prinsengracht. There was a steady stream of visitors, but, unlike today, it wasn't necessary to book, and oftentimes I was able to be in the rooms on my own and contemplate and pay silent tribute. The room which I found the most powerful and upsetting was Anne's bedroom, complete with the original pages from magazines she'd posted on the walls of her favourite film stars and royalty. I went to the window of the bedroom and was able to do what she wasn't during the 2 years she was in hiding: look out at the view during the daytime. I've visited the house several times since, but none had the same effect as that first one. In the summer of 1980, the women's cabaret group I had co-founded set off on a 2-month ad hoc busking tour around Europe. Most of our time in Germany was spent in Munich and Nuremberg, where there was no escaping the dark and relatively recent past of those cities. Nuremberg, city of the notorious laws which, amongst other things, revoked German citizenship for all Jews. The location for mass Nazi rallies from 1927 until 1938. The HQ of Julius Streicher and his poisonous propaganda paper Der Stürmer. Site of the Nuremberg war crime trials and military tribunals, and the place of execution for convicted war criminals who didn't take the easy way out with vials of poison. By the end of the war, there were no Jews left in Nuremberg. We visited the Zeppelin field in Nuremberg, the 360-metre wide grandstand built by Albert Speer. The sheer size of it, like most Nazi creations, cannot be imagined unless you see it. Dachau was the first concentration camp to be built in 1933, originally a place of incarceration for communists and politicians who opposed Hitler. It became the model upon which all subsequent camps were developed, although it was never an extermination camp. Nonetheless, the SS regime under which prisoners suffered was no less brutal. The slightest infringement of regulations resulted in flogging or execution. In the 12 years it operated, Dachau had around 200,000 prisoners. Thousands of them died from disease, starvation, or exhaustion from forced labour. After pressure from survivors, Bavaria agreed to make the site a place of remembrance, and on May the 9th, 1965, the Dachau concentration camp memorial site was opened. When I visited it in July 1980, I had prepared myself to be confronted with evidence of its horrors, which gave some semblance of what happened there. In fact, what I experienced that day, the reconstructed guard towers, the neat ditches, trees and grass, an exhibition building which was closed, and a rather ineffectual international monument, left me feeling very little. And that in itself made me feel angry. In fact, the most I felt was shock and surprise that after the war, a Carmelite convent had been established at the camp. During that tour, we narrowly escaped some atrocities carried out by a new generation of fascists. On the morning of Saturday, August the 2nd, a bomb exploded in a crowded waiting room in Bologna railway station next to a restaurant. 85 people died and over 200 were injured. 2 days later, we were in a train en route from Venice to Florence, which passed, slowly, through the station, right by the platform and the ruins of the buildings where so many had died and been injured. As we had no radio or access to newspapers, we had no idea what had happened until someone on the train told us. Just a few weeks after we returned to England, there were 2 other atrocities carried out by fascists. September the 26th, a bomb was set off at the main entrance to the Oktoberfest festival taking place in Theresienwiese field next to the English Garden where we had busked many times in Munich. 13 people were killed, more than 200 injured. Then, on October the 3rd, 1980, a synagogue in Paris was bombed, killing 4 and wounding 38. It took over 40 years to bring the murderer to justice. At the time, a leader in the Scotsman said, "It is sickening that within a generation's memory of the Holocaust and its concentration camps, Anti-Semitism should again raise its vile head in Europe. But hey, we know who's to blame for it all, don't we? Hitler didn't create anti-Semitism. He just plugged into what he knew was there, which mirrored his own bigotry. After World War I, this diminutive Austrian-born Lance Corporal was convinced that Jews were to blame for Germany's defeat, that his mother's death from cancer was somehow the fault of her Jewish doctor, and that a Jewish professor rejected his application to art school. With unemployment in Germany at 60% after World War I, Hitler used this as fuel to power the rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, utilising populist propaganda and slogans which appealed to a demoralised and demilitarised nation. The Nazis told people what they wanted to hear. In these circumstances, there always have to be scapegoats, in this case, Jews and communists. And the Nazis believed that all Jews were communists or agents of Bolshevism, ergo. The historian Raoul Hilberg said, "Since the 4th century, there have been 3 anti-Jewish policies: conversion, expulsion, and annihilation. The second appeared as an alternative to the first, and the third emerged as an alternative to the second." There's the centuries-old blood libel: Jews falsely accused of the ritual murder of Christian children. The first recorded instance of this occurred in Norwich in 1144, and it's still trotted out today. In 1290, England expelled all its Jewish residents, and in the next century, France, Germany and Portugal would do the same. When the Black Death struck Central Europe in 1349, Jews got the blame. They had poisoned the wells, apparently, and they were driven out of every country and given refuge in Poland and Russia. This habit of blaming Jews for spreading diseases has continued unabated. The Nazis, of course, used this to great effect, especially in Poland during World War II. And here in the UK, in 2024, we've seen this. It's a pity no one has invented a vaccine against ignorance and stupidity, isn't it? When Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881, again, it was the Jews what got the blame, and this was the excuse for the ensuing pogroms. Between 1881 and 1914, 2.5 million Jews fled Russia or were forced out, mostly settling in America. On March the 3rd, 1943, an air raid warning and the sound of anti-aircraft guns caused a panic at Bethnal Green tube station, then being used as an air raid shelter, and 173 people were killed in the rush to safety. The War Cabinet ordered an inquiry into the tragedy, which was written by Magistrate Maurice Dunn and submitted to the government a month later. In his report, Dunn noted one of the rumours about what had caused the disaster. Unfortunately, his report was not made public until January 1945, which meant that the rumour had an extra lifespan of nearly 2 years, and the damage was done. Some conspiracy theorists have claimed that Jews had prior knowledge of the 9/11 attacks and chose not to inform the US government. Oh, and that 4,000 Jews who worked in the World Trade Center were informed by Israeli intelligence agencies to stay home from work on that day. On November the 13th, 2015, Islamic State terrorists killed 130 people in Paris, at the Bataclan Theatre, in 4 cafes close to the theatre, and at the Stade de France. At the subsequent trial, it was revealed that the Bataclan was chosen because the killers believed it was owned by Jews. And there have even been anti-Semitic conspiracy theories regarding the involvement of Jews and Israel in the COVID-19 pandemic and in the development of vaccines. Ah, those pesky Jews, still creating life-saving vaccines, eh? Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, is the son of Sephardic Jews, who were among the 2,000 of 50,000 Jews from Thessalonica to survive the Holocaust. Elsewhere in Greece, another 17,000 Jews were murdered. In all, about 90% of the country's Jewish population were eradicated. Afraim Katzir, director of the Sephardic Heritage International, said that it is very inspiring that it is the son of Holocaust survivors who is on the front line of fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2017, in the aftermath of the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire, a volunteer called Tara Ahmed visited the site and then posted on Facebook, "London Tower Block Fire. Sinister connections with Jewish ritual sacrifice explored." In January 2018, she posted that Jews have always been the ones behind ritual torture, crucifixion and murder of children, especially young boys, as a way of atoning for their sins in order to be allowed back into Palestine. In January 2022, Ahmed was convicted of 2 counts of stirring up racial hatred and jailed for 11 months. And, according to some of the more severely deluded, Israel was actually responsible for the October the 7th attacks on its own people. Yes, that's right. This was seen on a demonstration in London in January 2024. Jews had lived in Poland for 800 years before the Nazi occupation. On the eve of the invasion, there were 3.3 million Jews there, more than in any other country in Europe. Well, this was largely because so many other countries had expelled them at regular intervals over a 500-year period, and Poland was where most of them settled and prospered. In 1938, German diplomat Ernst von Rath was assassinated at the embassy in Paris by Herschel Greenspun, a 17-year-old Polish Jewish refugee. It was in retaliation for the Gestapo's brutal deportation of all 12,000 Polish Jews living in Germany then, including Greenspun's family. And that was all the excuse the Nazis needed to encourage German civilians to wreak their own revenge on all Jews during the barbaric Kristallnacht, which took place on November the 9th and 10th. In Germany, 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed. 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, and thousands were tortured. At least 91 lost their lives in the violence. 267 synagogues were destroyed. Between 1933 and 1943, Germany enacted 400 specifically anti-Jewish laws and decrees. By 1938, half of the Jews in Germany had applied for exit visas. Right-wing governments in Romania, Hungary and Slovakia adopted anti-Semitic programs. In Poland, the Catholic Church were keen that the country's Jews convert from Judaism to Catholicism. What should we call it? The debate continues even today. We know it mostly as the Holocaust, from the Greek word holocauston, a translation of the Hebrew word olah, meaning large-scale slaughter or destruction. But many survivors, including Primo Levi, didn't favour this term. The Hebrew word Shoah means a whirlwind of destruction. It could all even be described as a perfect storm of evil, formed out of the destructive elements of hatred, barbarity, and unimaginable cruelty. A storm driven by the prevailing winds of anti-Semitism, which were fanned by fear, ignorance, malevolent patriotism, and a thirst for power. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Centre, is clear. The Holocaust was unprecedented genocide, total and systematic, perpetrated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators, with the aim of annihilating the Jewish people. Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel, survivor of 2 extermination camps, said, "It is obvious that the war which Hitler and his accomplices waged was a war not only against Jewish men, women and children, but also against Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, and therefore Jewish memory." And as Clive James said, "The German Jews were the most assimilated in Europe. They were vital to Germany's culture, which indeed has never recovered from their extinction. They couldn't see they were hated in direct proportion to their learning, vitality and success." On August 31st, 1939, members of the SS dressed up as Polish soldiers and attacked the Gliwice radio station in Germany. And that was the premise for the Nazi invasion of Poland the next day. During the first weeks of the invasion, 45,000 unarmed Polish citizens were murdered. 22,000 captured Polish soldiers were shot, as were intellectuals, Jews and non-Jews. And then that's when Stalin, another mass murderer for whom I hope hell has a special place, played his evil hand. Under the terms of an earlier agreement made between Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov and German Foreign Secretary Ribbentrop, on September the 17th, 1939, the Soviets invaded Poland and occupied the eastern part of the country. Within 3 weeks, the German forces had defeated Poland's army, and the country was divided into 3 regions. The western and northern provinces were annexed to the Reich, eastern districts to the Soviet Union and Lithuania, and central Poland became the general government. Thus, approximately 1.8 million Jews were now living in the German-occupied zone of Poland, and more than 1 million Polish Jews were under Soviet rule. Jews had lived in Krakow since the 13th century, and by 1939 there were around 80,000 in the city. Nazi troops entered Krakow on September the 8th, 1939, and made it the capital of their entire eastern occupied territories. All its 7 synagogues were closed and looted by the SS, and all Jews were forced to wear white armbands bearing the Blue Star of David and had to report for forced labour. On November the 6th, 1939, the Nazis carried out Sonderaktion Krakauer, part of a plan to eliminate what they saw as the intellectual elite in Poland. Professors and academics from Krakow's universities were summoned to Lecture Room 56 in the Collegium Novum, where they were informed that they did not have permission to begin the new academic year. 184 people were assaulted and arrested by armed police, taken to detention centres and then sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. A number of the older professors, including Stanislaw Streicher, did not survive the harsh conditions of the camp. By August 1940, 23,000 Jews had been allowed to voluntarily leave Krakow. As part of the Germanisation of Poland, the city's national monuments were destroyed or removed. The street signs where Jews had lived were removed and replaced with German names, even the historic main market square. The new Jewish cemetery in the neighbourhood of Kazimierz was immediately closed. The SS dug up the most valuable stone and marble and sold it to local masons, while other headstones were also removed and used to pave the supply road to Płaszów concentration camp, which itself stood on the site of 2 other destroyed cemeteries. The cemetery's caretaker, Pina Ladna, was sent to Płaszów forced labour camp and murdered there. The cemetery itself was left a mess of scattered bones and open graves. In October 1941, Germany issued a decree that any Polish citizen who helped Jews in any way would be arrested and executed. Despite this, one estimate says that nearly 10% of the non-Jewish population did indeed offer aid. As Jewish and non-Jewish citizens were arrested and awaiting execution, death posters in Polish would appear around the city, listing the condemned as a warning to anyone who resisted occupation or did not comply with the new rules. After the conquest of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union in September 1939, most of the Jews remaining within the area occupied by Germany were imprisoned in ghettos. Then in June 1941, after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, they began to imprison the rest of the Polish Jews in ghettos. They were told that it was to protect them from Polish anti-Semitism. As Jonathan Freeland wrote, the Nazis lied to their victims at every step of their journey towards destruction. Step after step after step. Michael Elkins agreed. This is the key. The Jews did not know what was planned for them. They went into the ghettos believing there was safety to be found. Safety at its most basic, pitiful, primitive meaning. The absence of violent death. The Nazis established 1,150 Jewish ghettos in the countries they occupied. But again, it wasn't a new idea. In 1424, Jews in Frankfurt were removed from the citizen rolls as enemies of the cross of Christ and locked into a walled ghetto. Between October 1939 and December 1940, nearly all of Poland's 2 million Jews were sent to ghettos. In Lodz, from May 1940, more than 165,000 Jews were forced to live in an area of less than 4 square kilometres. In Warsaw, 400,000 Jews, a third of the city's population, were confined to a 1.3 mile square block. The daily food ration per Jewish person was 184 calories, compared to 669 for a Pole and 2,613 for a German. Most of the ghetto inhabitants were forced to work in Nazi labour camps. Overcrowding and poor food in the ghettos led to many deaths from disease and starvation. 80,000 died in the Warsaw ghetto alone because of this. The Krakow ghetto was established in March 1941 in the Podgorze district of the city, across the river Vistula. All the Jews of Krakow were forced to march from Kazimierz across the Pilsudski and other bridges. For many of them, this was the last sight they had of their home. Each person was allowed only 25 kilograms of belongings. The Nazis made Jewish forced labour build the ghetto walls, which had stones designed to look like Jewish tombstones, topped with barbed wire. The Krakow ghetto consisted of just 320 buildings. Each person was allotted 2 square metres. Thus, 15,000 people were crammed into an area formerly homed to 3,000 people. Inhabitants included Roman Polanski and his family. Polish pharmacist Tadeusz Pangewicz, proprietor of the pharmacy under the Eagle, chose to remain in the ghetto. Not only did he often provide Jews with free medication, he allowed his premises to be used for meetings of the Jewish leaders, smuggled food into the ghetto, and allowed valuables to be deposited in his shop for safekeeping just before the liquidation of the ghetto. In 1941, the size of the ghetto was reduced by the Nazis, while forcing Jewish residents from 29 nearby villages to move there as well. Between May 1942 and March 1943, the ghetto was systematically liquidated, and inhabitants sent to Belzec and Auschwitz concentration camps and Płaszów slave labour camp, a 200-acre site on the outskirts of Krakow. The atrocities committed there by the commandant Armand Gurt, were accurately depicted in Schindler's List. But at least there was one member of the Nazi Party in Krakow who wanted to save Jews, not kill them. It's been well documented how Leopold Poldek Pfefferberg, most of whose family were murdered by the Nazis, moved to America and opened a leather goods shop in Beverly Hills, where, in 1980, Thomas Connelly came in to buy a briefcase. When Pfefferberg discovered he was a writer, he showed him his file of documents relating to industrialist, spy and Nazi Oskar Schindler, and thus became directly responsible for the 1982 best-selling novel and the Oscar-winning 1993 film. Pfefferberg said, "Schindler gave me my life, so I tried to give him immortality." After the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, Oskar Schindler got permission to build a sub-camp of Płaszów forced labour camp next to his DEF factory on Krakowska Street. In 1940, he paid for a new 3-storey factory to be built at 4 Lipowa Street. SS officers were not allowed inside this factory. The company produced kitchen pots and pans and mess tins for the German military, and from 1941, cases and fuses for bullets and shells. This sub-camp was surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, but the factory workers lived in the Krakow ghetto. However, through bribery and use of the black market, spending 50,000 zlotys a month, Schindler obtained better rations for his workers, although conditions in the factory itself were inhospitable and a breeding ground for typhus. For each Polish Jewish worker, he paid the SS 4 zlotys per day for a woman and 5 zlotys per day for a man. The number of Polish Jewish workers at the factory increased from over 150 in 1940 to around 1,100 in 1944. When the Nazis closed the factory in September 1944, the prisoners were taken to Płaszów camp. However, within weeks, Schindler managed to have them transferred to his new factory in Brunlitz in Moravia, now the Czech Republic. The list of the Jews who would be saved was typed up in Schindler's office by Mietek Pemper and Carmen Whiteman. In 2005, the factory became the property of the city of Krakow. The administration building became the excellent Schindler Factory Museum, recollecting the Nazi occupation of Poland and the horrors it brought, but also celebrating Jewish life in Poland and Krakow before the invasion. The names and faces of all the 1,100 Jews who Schindler saved are commemorated there. But what of the rest of Europe? In March 1942, the Slovakian government actually paid to have their Jews deported. It agreed to pay Germany 500 marks per person. In October 1940, French President Pétain entered a pact of collaboration with Hitler. They had much in common. Pétain also blamed Jews, communists and even Freemasons for his country's defeat during World War II. By this time, all Jewish shops had been ordered to display signs stating Jewish businesses. In Vichy, France, in July 1942, 5,000 French police and gendarmes rounded up nearly 3,000 Jewish people, 4,000 of whom were children, and interned them in the Veldier Velodrome. Their final destinations were extermination and concentration camps. As Nazi hunter Serge Klarsfeld said, "These are acts that France had to answer for, and will always have to answer for." But there were some French families who had nothing to answer for. One such was the Aznavourian family, who themselves had fled to France to escape the Armenian genocide during World War I. When the Nazi roundup of Jews in Paris began, the Asnavurian family sheltered some in the basement of their home. In 2017, 2 members of the family were given the Raoul Wallenberg Award in recognition of their role in saving Jewish lives. They were Ada Asnavurian and her brother Charles. Between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis built more than 42,000 main and satellite concentration camps throughout Europe. There were 30,000 slave labour camps, 980 concentration camps, 500 brothels with sex slaves, and euthanasia camps. At Auschwitz I, the brothel for prisoners was established in August 1943 on the second story of Block 24, with 20 German, Polish and Russian female prisoners. The men who visited were charged 2 marks, of which 3/4 went to the camp's administration. There were forced labour camps, transit camps, and of course mass extermination camps. Nearly 3,000 camps of various types were built in and around Berlin alone. But even before the extermination camps went into full operation, more than 1.5 million Jews in Eastern Europe were murdered in what has been called the Shoah by bullets, shot to death in forests and even in town centres by SS action groups. Auschwitz. It's such a familiar name, isn't it? And yet it didn't even exist before 1940. It was another example of the Germanisation of Poland, the name the Nazis gave to the city of Auschwitz, about 40 miles west of Krakow. Auschwitz is a Moravian word, meaning of all things, blessed place. But there wasn't just one Auschwitz. It had 44 sub-camps attached to German farms and industrial plants and factories, where camp prisoners were sent to work as slave labour to support the Nazi war machine. Toiling for 12 hours a day, they produced armoured vehicles, cannons, parts for aircraft and submarines. They mined coal and generated electricity, and grew and processed food. There were the 6 extermination camps created with the express purpose of murdering Jews, and 8 euthanasia camps for the express purpose of murdering people with disabilities, or useless eaters, as the Nazis called them. Extermination camps were known as Vernichtungslager. Vernichtung means to make something into nothing. The camps were nothing more than human extermination facilities. Their purpose, industrialised murder. They were Chelmno, Belzec, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka and Majdanek Lublin, originally used for slave labour. They were built in occupied Poland because it had the biggest Jewish population in Nazi-occupied countries, and because it was easier to keep them a secret from the German civilians. These fiendish camps had a welcome sign for their prisoners: Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. The most famous and photographed at Auschwitz I survived the war, although Soviet troops removed it and were going to send it back east. But it did not survive the greed of a Swedish neo-Nazi who had it stolen to order in December 2009. The thieves probably hadn't realised that it was 5 metres in width and found it wouldn't fit into their getaway vehicle, so they cut it into 3 pieces. It was found, together with the thieves, in northern Poland and returned to the Auschwitz Museum. It took conservators a year to repair it, and it was decided that a copy be made instead and replace the original at the camp's entrance. construction of Auschwitz I, an abandoned Polish army barracks, began in April 1940, mostly built by prisoners of war. It initially had one gas chamber in the basement of Block 4 and one crematorium situated underground as well. The camp was bordered by 3-metre concrete posts, 4 metres apart, with barbed wire. This wire was electrically charged from evening until early morning roll call. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz and then Auschwitz-Birkenau, was, according to his own grandson, the greatest mass murderer in history. Höss told his wife and children that the camp he commanded was a prison. The first gas chamber at Auschwitz I was just 190 yards from the Höss home, on the other side of a fence. In the autumn of 1943, the Nazis dismantled it and turned it into an SS air raid shelter. After the war, the Polish government reconstructed it and the adjoining crematorium. Reconstruction or not, I defy anyone who enters these rooms not to feel physically sick and chilled to the bone. Prisoners who were put to work at the camps were never going to last long. As the Verber Wetzler report stated, our food consisted of a fairly thick soup early in the morning, which had to be eaten with our hands. We got the same soup again at lunch. The evening meal consisted of a brew called tea, 300 grams of bad bread, and some 20 to 30 grams of marmalade or artificial fat of the worst quality. Illnesses increased as a result of this bad food and intolerable living conditions. More and more of the sick were now being taken to the crematorium. Prisoners were also beaten by guards and capos on the slightest pretext, or oftentimes no pretext at all. Experiments and forced sterilisations were carried out in Block 10, the so-called Hygiene Institute. 1,500 people died as a direct result of Mengelé's horrific so-called experiments. The Black Wall, or Death Wall, is situated between blocks 10 and 11, where thousands of victims were shot by the SS after being held in the death cells. Most of these victims were not entered in the camp records. All prisoners arriving at the camps had their heads shorn of hair. Only prisoners selected for slave labour were given a serial number, which was tattooed onto an arm and sewn onto their camp clothing, which also bore a coloured triangle. For Jews, this was a yellow star. This was not a Nazi invention, but something borrowed from 12th century Christian Europe, where Jews were forced to wear them. In the 18th century Prussia, Jews had to pay the emperor 8,000 thaler each for the mandatory wearing of a yellow star to be abolished. At the camps, prisoners were photographed at 3 angles, just like criminals: face on, side on, and with a hat or cap on. Some 50,000 fellow prisoners were photographed by Polish political prisoner 3444 Wilhelm Brasser. Those sent directly to the gas chambers were not registered or photographed. Auschwitz I had the capacity for 10,000 prisoners. At Birkenau, it was 100,000 in 300 wooden barracks, which had mud floors, no heating or artificial light. 8 villages, 435 acres, the size of 319 football fields, were expropriated and their residents deported, and all the buildings were demolished to construct Birkenau. Birkenau was the name the Nazis gave to the nearby village of Brzezinka, which was about 2 miles from Auschwitz I. In October 1941, 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war were forced to build Birkenau, initially as a concentration work camp. Many died from the cold weather. But in 1942, Birkenau's sole purpose became an extermination camp. A railway line was constructed that led directly to its centre. The infamous gateway to hell at Birkenau was originally lopsided. It had no right side. But in 1943, the same year as its first gas chamber became operational, it was expanded to be symmetrical. It looks like a face with a giant mouth permanently agape, appropriate given that it swallowed up hundreds of thousands of human beings. Gassing operations were moved to Birkenau. Its first 2 chambers, known as Bunker 1 and 2, were 2 converted farmhouses, the Little Red House and the Little White House, all that remained of the village of Brzezinka. But these weren't enough for the Nazis' purposes, so between March and June 1943, 4 large gas chambers, disrobing rooms and crematoria were built there. The largest rooms in the extermination camps were the so-called underground changing rooms, which could accommodate up to 1,000 people at one time, who would descend downstairs from the main campgrounds, were forced to strip and leave their clothing hanging on hooks before entering the baths and disinfecting rooms, i.e. the adjacent gas chambers. In September 1941, the SS had conducted the first tests of Zyklon B, hydrogen cyanide in pellet form, on Soviet prisoners of war and sick Polish prisoners at Auschwitz I. Nazi doctors had already tried the gas out on mentally ill patients. Zyklon B was manufactured by Degesch, a company owned by IG Farben. It was used to get rid of vermin, which is how the Nazis regarded Jewish people. Each tin of pellets weighed 200 grams and cost just 5 marks for 5 tins. Once exposed to the air, the pellets gave off cyanide gas. The tin labels read "Danger, Poison, for Pest Control, to be opened by trained personnel only." At the camps, the trained personnel sprinkled crystals through the 4 openings in each gas chamber roof. The Birkenau crematoria contained 52 ovens. They were needed because the facilities at Auschwitz I weren't killing people quickly enough, and also because so many victims were now being murdered, their bodies were having to be burned in pits. Each crematorium had 4 lifts with automatic sliding doors. Sonderkommandos were formed of the strongest and fittest of the male prisoners, and it was them who were made to do the dirty work the SS didn't want to soil their hands with. It was the Sonderkommandos who supervised those selected for murder to undress, to walk them into the shower rooms, to remove their bodies and extract gold teeth before taking them to the burning pits or crematoria, and to clean up the gas chambers afterwards. Crematoria capacity at Birkenau was 20,000 bodies per day. Each body took 15 minutes to burn. To achieve maximum effectiveness, children were placed between 2 adults. In just 24 hours, nearly 5,000 bodies could be destroyed. Wherever you stand in Birkenau, you can't see where it ends. It doesn't end where the woods begin, as that was where the 2 farmhouses stood, which were turned into gas chambers, and also where thousands of Jewish victims were made to stand and await their cruel fate. Block 25 was known as the Block of Death, or waiting room for the gas. It was used as a temporary housing facility for women selected to go to the gas chambers. It was a stone-walled construction with wooden slatted planks, no mattresses, and no artificial light. Each plank measured 1.8 metres by 2 metres, and sometimes there were as many as 9 women on each one. It's from the Warsaw Ghetto. By the time they ended on September 21st, some 265,000 inhabitants of the ghetto had been deported to the Treblinka extermination camp. 17,000 stones of varying sizes commemorate the 900,000 victims of the Holocaust, whose final resting place is Treblinka. 216 of the stones bear the names of the cities and towns from which Jews were transported to Treblinka. Approximately 1,700,000 Jews, primarily from Poland, were murdered in Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka by the end of 1943. At Belzec, 2,000 Jews were killed every day for 10 months solid. 3/4 of the Holocaust victims died during a 20-month period. Sobibor Extension Camp opened in 1942. Most of those taken there were killed within hours of arrival, which meant there were never more than 600 prisoners in the camp at any given time. It's estimated that nearly 250,000 Jews are murdered there in less than 2 years. After the Nazi invasion of Hungary in March 1944, its regent Horthy succumbed to pressure to deport the country's 800,000 Jews to concentration camps to be killed. Deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau began in May 1944, and in just 8 weeks, some 424,000 Jews were rounded up by Hungarian police and deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. For the Nazis, everything was going to plan. Without the railway network, it might never have happened. Trains were the only way to transport such large numbers of people to each camp. There were 100,000 miles of tracks across 12 occupied countries. It needed the use of just 2,000 trains to transport 2/3 of Europe's Jews to their deaths. Only 147 trains were needed to remove 450,000 Hungarian Jews from their homeland to be murdered. The records of the train movements still exist. Most Jews were actually forced to pay to travel on the trains, and part of the money was given to the German Transport Authority. So say 8 million people, 4 pfennigs per kilometre of track, times 600 miles, which was the average voyage. That's about 240 million marks. The unloading platforms and ramps were literally the end of the line. Each railway carriage was 31.5 feet in length, 14 foot high from the bottom of the wheels, and just 11 feet wide. Some transport consisted of 50 carriages, with 100 to 150 people crammed into each one, which meant about 7,000 people per transport. Later, the Werber-Wetzler report revealed They had received no water for days. They were utterly exhausted, and about 100 of them had died during the journey. The living were lined up in rows of 5. The dead, and this included anyone unable to stand on his feet, were piled in a heap. Luggage and parcels were collected and stacked up. Then the railroad cars had to be thoroughly cleaned so that no trace of their frightful load was left behind. The victims themselves fueled an industry of death. Every part of them and their belongings was pillaged and put to use to fuel the Nazi war and extermination machines. As journalist Marek Zerjak has said, for the Germans, nothing in the camp could be wasted. The camp was not only a factory of death, it was also a huge profit-making enterprise. The Werber-Wetzler report tells of huge sheds full of knapsacks, suitcases and other luggage. We had to open each piece of baggage and sort the contents. Combs, mirrors, sugar, canned food, chocolate, medicines, etc. Underwear, shirts and clothes of all kinds went to a special barrack. Gold, money, banknotes and precious stones had to be handed over to the political section. However, many of these objects were stolen by the SS guards. The suitcases were marked with each person's name and the number of the transport they were on. The items they contained were exactly what you would pack if you were going to be setting up a new home. Toiletries, clothes for winters and summers, toys and kitchen utensils. Their spectacles were taken from them while they were still alive. Other physical aids were removed from their corpses before they went to the crematoria. All of these items were taken to a section of the camp known as Canada, which was a series of wooden warehouses. 5 days before the camp's liberation, these buildings were burned by the SS. In the summer of 1943, a workshop for melting down the gold was set up on the ground floor of Crematorium 3. The gold teeth pulled from the mouths of victims prior to cremation were soaked in hydrochloric acid to remove any remains, and then melted into moulds and turned into bars. Technicians who had to do this told survivor Philip Möller that they often melted down up to 10 kilos of gold a day. Even hair had value, especially women's hair, as it was longer and thicker than that of men and children. It's estimated that each victim had around 100 grams of hair. This was shorn from corpses, cured above the crematorium ovens, and then made into bales each weighing 20 kilos, and sold for 1 mark per kilo. So, 10 victims per kilo, 200 victims per bale. 200 victims per bale. The hair was bought by German textile companies, including the Bremen Wool Carding Company and the Alex Zinc Felt Factory, to make clothes, mattresses, carpets, rope, thread, and insulation for the boots of railroad workers. Some was used to make wigs. When Auschwitz was liberated by Russian troops, they found nearly 8 tons of human hair in paper bags. That's 100 kilograms a ton. 100 victims per kilo. 10,000 victims per ton. 77,000 victims. That's twice the population of the town where I now live. Visitors to Auschwitz are not allowed to photograph the hair in the cases, and some believe it should not even be on display. However, one survivor, Ernest Michel, said, "There is nothing that speaks louder against the Nazi crimes than this hair. No matter how painful it is to look at, it is all part of the story that I believe has to be told." Some of the victims' ashes were used as fertiliser at the farm labour camp, Homenz, or sold to a German company, which must have particularly satisfied Himmler, the former fertiliser salesman. When the Soviet army arrived at Auschwitz in January 1945, the SS hadn't had time to destroy all the camp storerooms. The Soviet troops found 3,800 suitcases, 12,000 kitchen utensils, 470 prosthetic limbs and physical aids, 110,000 shoes, 837,000 women's coats and dresses, and 370,000 men's suits. They also found 905 empty Zyklon B cans. Here's the thing, they did. But, as Jonathan Freeland has said, it cannot have been easy to believe in such a thing as a death factory. After all, no place like it had ever existed before. It was outside human experience, and perhaps outside human imagination. In November 1944, after reading the Werber-Wetzler report, John Pearl, director of the American government's War Refugee Board, wrote, "So revolting and diabolical are the German atrocities that the minds of civilised people find it difficult to believe that they have actually taken place." On August the 22nd, 1939, Hitler had held a secret meeting with the German military and intelligence leaders, which outlined his desire for war on an all-or-nothing basis, and the invasion of Poland in a war of extermination, and also referred to genocide. One of those present, Wilhelm Canaris, was so appalled by all this, he took notes and smuggled them to the Berlin correspondent. On December the 16th, 1939, an article was published in the Times, which stated that it was clear that the aim of deporting Jews from Germany and occupied countries was to set up a place for gradual extermination. In May 1942, by which time some 700,000 Jews had already been murdered, a courier from the Jewish Socialist Bund of Poland reached England with a shocking report. It began, "From the day the Russo-German War broke out, the Germans embarked on the physical extermination of the Jewish population on Polish soil." It also stressed that the killings were not isolated outbursts, but part of a systematic plan to annihilate all the Jews in Europe, town by town, country by country. Polish soldier Jan Karski was twice smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and also into Belzec by the Jewish underground in order to directly observe what was happening to Polish Jews. He wrote, "I know that it never in the history of mankind did anything occur to compare with what was inflicted on the Jewish population of Poland." Karski reported to the Polish, British and US governments on the situation, especially on the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Nazi extermination of Polish Jews. Based on Karski's information, the Polish foreign minister in exile provided the Allies with one of the earliest and most accurate accounts of the Nazi Holocaust. Karski himself met with Polish politicians in exile and also spoke to the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden and even writers such as H.G. Wells and Arthur Koestler. He travelled to the United States and on the 28th of July 1943 he met with President Roosevelt. He was the first eyewitness to tell Roosevelt of the situation in Poland. Captain Witold Pilecki, a Polish army officer, volunteered to collect information about Auschwitz and allowed himself to be arrested in September 1940. He spent over 2 years in the camp as a forced labourer before escaping on April 26, 1943. What became known as Vitola's report was smuggled out of Poland via Sweden to London. Unfortunately, it was judged by the Allies to be exaggerated and not fully trustworthy. Just like Jan Karski's report, it was refuted, and the suggestions that a military liberation of the camp, or at least the bombing of the railway tracks, were not carried out. In November 1942, the General Secretary of the World Jewish Congress had gone to the US consulate in Geneva and revealed the Nazi plan to murder all Jews. The news was imparted to the US Secretary of State and Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary. In response, major Jewish film stars such as Paul Muni, Edward G. Robinson and John Garfield took part in a pageant called We Will Never Die, with music by Kurt Weill, at Madison Square Garden on March the 9th, 1943. Muni told the audience, which included Eleanor Roosevelt and some members of Congress, "This is not a Jewish problem. It is a problem that belongs to humanity." Another 1943 report was given to the British government, stating that spring, the total number of victims who met their death in the gas chambers amounted to 800,000 people. The Polish Major's report, also from 1943, stated that, with the exception of the Polish Jews, the other Jews had no idea what was in store for them. We were told by Dutch and French Jews that the Germans had informed them that they were leaving their country to be transferred to Poland, where everyone would be able to continue work in his own profession, and they were to take their whole fortune with them and liquid cash for at least 6 weeks. In May 1944, Allied planes flew over Auschwitz and took aerial photographs which clearly showed the gas chambers and smoke emanating from the burning pits. Several months later, Allied bombers attacked the IG Farben rubber plant and munitions factories just a few miles away from Auschwitz. However, the US dismissed requests from Jewish organisations that the camps themselves should be bombed. 50 years later, Russian General Vasily Petrenko revealed that Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt had all known about the location and purpose of Auschwitz since the summer of 1942. Here's the thing, they did. When Israeli Holocaust scholar Yehuda Bauer died in October 2024, fellow historian Dr. David Silberklang said, "In Israel, there had been shame and guilt around the perception that European Jews had gone like sheep to the slaughter." Bauer's research delved into different aspects of Jewish resistance and began to change the narrative. Approximately 1.5 million Jews fought in World War II, in the Allied armies, in the partisan units, in the underground movements, and in the ghettos. In February 1941, the Communist Party in Amsterdam organised a national strike in response to arrests of hundreds of Jewish men in the city. Around 300,000 workers in the Amsterdam area took part. The Akiva youth movement in Krakow published an underground paper, The Fighting Pioneer, and worked with and co-founded a local wing of the Jewish fighting organisation, supported by the Polish underground group, Armia Krajowa. Their resistance activities included the December 1942 bombing of Krakow's Sygeneria Cafe, a popular haunt of Gestapo and Wehrmacht officers. On April 28, 1945, an armed revolt took place in the town of Dachau. Both former and escaped concentration camp prisoners and a civilian militia company took part. On October 14, 1943, all 600 prisoners at Sobibor killed 11 SS guards and police and set fire to the camp. 300 of them escaped through the wire fences, traversing a minefield and escaping into the forest. 100 were recaptured and executed, but 60 escapees survived the war. After this revolt, exterminations at Sobibor stopped, and the SS demolished the camp to hide evidence from the advancing Soviet troops. On August 2nd, 1943, 1,000 Jewish prisoners revolted in Treblinka, setting fire to the killing centre part of the camp. They killed some of the camp commanders and guards, took over the armoury, and set the gas chambers and the camp barracks ablaze. 400 prisoners managed to escape. 70 survived the war. Again, after this uprising, the camp was slowly shut down. Armed revolts also took place in 20 of the ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the spring of 1943 was the biggest single act of resistance by Jews. Thousands refused to comply with SS orders to report to assembly points for deportation to the camps, and hundreds, armed mostly only with handguns and bottles of petrol, fought thousands of German troops on the ghetto streets and in the buildings for a month. 13,000 Jews were killed. Around 6,000 were burned alive or died from smoke inhalation. On the 19th of April 1943, 7,000 Jews were transported from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka extermination camp. Marla Zimmertbaum was proficient in several languages, so after she was arrested, she was allowed to work as a camp interpreter at Birkenau. She and her lover, Edvard Galinski, escaped from the camp in September 1944, but were captured and then publicly executed in front of the other prisoners. These events were depicted in the TV film Playing for Time. Incredibly, locks of their hair were given to another prisoner in a piece of paper, who then gave it to the Auschwitz Museum in 1969, where they remain today in the archives. Numbers of Jewish women imprisoned at Birkenau were forced to work at Union Commando, the munitions factory 3.5 kilometres from the camp. At great risk, they gradually smuggled out small quantities of gunpowder in tiny pieces of paper concealed in their clothing, which they gave to Sonderkommandos involved in the Jewish resistance. On October the 7th, 1944, several hundred of the Sonderkommandos learned they were going to be killed and decided to act. They killed 3 guards and they blew up Crematorium 4. 250 of them died during the attack and 200 were murdered afterwards. As Philipp Müller wrote, these 450 men had fought bravely and died honourably, refusing to resign themselves meekly to their fate. However, as Otto Friedrich said, they did almost everything wrong. The uprising had originally been planned for the night, but started in broad daylight. And since the uprising had not been coordinated with the Polish underground, there were no partisan units to help anyone who escaped. Incredibly, the SS were able to identify from which stocks of gunpowder at the Union factory caused the explosion, and thus which women prisoners were involved. 4 of them, Ulla Gertner, Rosa Batota, Regina Safferstein, and Estusia Friedblom, were tortured and then publicly hung in January 1945. It was the last public execution at the camp. There have been several film versions of Operation Valkyrie, the last major attempt to assassinate Hitler in July 1944, carried out by senior Wehrmacht officers including Klaus von Stauffenberg. Hitler narrowly escaped, and von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators were executed and buried in the Alter St. Matthäus Kirchhof cemetery in Berlin. The day after, the SS exhumed them, stripping von Stauffenberg's body of medals and insignia. The bodies were cremated and the ashes scattered in an unknown location. That's how Auschwitz-Birkenau has been accurately described, and it's about as far away from being a Jewish house of life as it's possible to get. Many of the victims' ashes were dumped into the camp's ponds. As journalist Marek Zerjak has said, The ground is literally saturated with blood and still mixed with the ashes of the murdered. The day I visited in September 2024, it was untypically hot and it rained all day, which I felt were suitably unpleasant conditions. A bright, sunny, blue sky day would somehow have not been right. The paths and the grounds of Birkenau were muddy and full of puddles, and it was impossible to lead there with clean, dry shoes. When I got back to my hotel, I couldn't bring myself to brush off the mud and dirt that had gathered on my shoes. So I put them in a bag, and I didn't wear them again for the remainder of my time in Krakow. When I got home, I carefully brushed the soil off and placed it in an encased bauble in this pendant, which is actually designed to hold cremains. Since 1955, Yad Vashem World Holocaust Remembrance Centre has been working to preserve the memory of all the Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust by collecting their names. However, some 1 million victims remain unidentified. Of those known, if one name was read out every second, non-stop, it would take about 70 days to say them all. These are some of the names I know, sent to their deaths in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Regina Jonas, the first woman to hold the office of rabbi, was deported to Theresienstadt and then, in 1944, to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she was murdered. 3/4 of Billy Wilder's family, including his mother, were murdered there, as was Fred Zinnemann's mother, Anna. Child actress Leah Deutsch, known as the Croatian Shirley Temple. When she was 16, her family were arrested in Zagreb in May 1943 and sent to Auschwitz. There were 75 people in their wagon, and the journey took 6 days, with no food or water. 25 of them did not survive, including Leah. Kurt Geron was an actor and film director who had appeared in The Blue Angel and also sang the first public performance of Mac the Knife. He was forced by the Nazis to make a propaganda film showing how wonderful conditions were at the Theresienstadt ghetto. In June 1944, a delegation from the International Red Cross visited what the Nazis described as a family camp and a spa town where elderly German Jews could retire in safety. In reality, it was a forced labour camp and an assembly camp from which Jews would be sent to extermination camps. Many thousands died in this ghetto from disease and starvation. Prior to the Red Cross visit, it was given a substantial makeover with newly planted gardens, streets that were renamed and cleaned, fake shops and a school, freshly painted houses and renovated barracks. Thus fooled, the delegation reported that treatment of its inhabitants was favourable and that no Jews were deported from the ghetto. In fact, by that time, 68,000 had been deported. The minute filming was finished, Geron was packed onto the final transport to Auschwitz. Alma Rose was an Austrian violinist and the niece of Gustav Mahler. For 10 months, she was conductor of the Women's Orchestra at Birkenau, which played music for their fellow prisoners as they marched to and from their slave work, and also during selections for the gas chambers. Rose died there in April 1944. Her death was ascribed to botulism. German artist Charlotte Salomon and her husband were hiding in the south of France in 1943 when they were arrested, sent to Auschwitz and murdered soon after arriving. Charlotte was 5 months pregnant at the time. Charles Chaim Mangel was a kosher butcher, originally from Poland. He and his wife Anne moved to Strasbourg and had 2 sons, Alain and Marcel. After the Nazi invasion, the family fled to Limoges. Still only in their teens, the Mangel sons joined the French Jewish resistance, helping to create forged identity cards for Jewish children and leading many of them to safety, across the Swiss border. However, it was their father Charles who was arrested by the Gestapo in 1944 and sent to the Drancy camp and from thence to Auschwitz. It is presumed he was killed soon after arrival. His wife and children survived the war, and his youngest son Marcel changed his surname and became the world's greatest mime artist. In 2001, he was awarded the Wallenberg Medal in recognition of his resistance work. The last gassings at Birkenau took place at the end of October 1944. A month later, the order came to destroy the gas chambers and crematoria, and all the paperwork pertaining to the camp's activities. Under the rubble of Crematorium 2, the gas chamber is still intact, but not accessible to visitors. When Soviet troops arrived, they found 648 unburied corpses and 7,600 survivors, many of whom were barely alive. They included Otto Frank. His wife Edith had died at Birkenau, and their daughters Anne and Margot perished of typhus at Belsen-Bergen. Around 800,000 people have survived the various camps, but the Nazis weren't finished with them. They were forced to walk on marches of death. Between early January and April 1945, 250,000 of them died, shot, burned alive, or frozen to death. A total of 5,000 European towns, villages and shtetls were destroyed by the Nazis. In 1933, there were around 9.5 million Jews in Europe. By 1945, the figure was down to 3.5 million. 2 out of every 3 people had been murdered. Germany's Jewish population had been 565,000. After World War II, it was 34,000, reduced by 94%. Out of the more than 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, over 4 million were in Poland and the Soviet Union. More than 1.2 million of them were children. Over 92,000 Jews lived in Prague before World War II. They were almost 20% of the city's population. At least 2/3 of these people perished in the Holocaust. As of 2024, about 1,600 Jews live in Prague. The city has many Jewish museums and memorials, including the Pinkas Synagogue, built in 1535. Inscribed on its walls are the names of nearly 80,000 Bohemian and Moravian Jews murdered by the Nazis. Berlin's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe consists of 2,701 giant grey concrete pillars. The memorial occupies a site the size of 4 football fields, about 8 acres, just a fraction of Birkenau's 346 acres. There is no one way to navigate this concrete maze, no one way to experience it. Descending into the labyrinthian network of grey and gloom, you start to lose sight of the light, as victims lost sight of it in the camps, and with it, hope. Only about 10% of Poland's Jews survived the war. In Holland, about 80% of its Jews perished. Most of the Jews of Slovakia, Hungary, Greece and Yugoslavia were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators, but almost 75% of the Jews living under Bulgarian rule survived. As one historian has said, The Jews have never replaced themselves. In 1948, 9 out of 93 directors of the IG Farben Company were found guilty of corporate plunder in occupied territories. But by the start of 1951, they were all free men again. Topf and Sons engineer Kurt Profer and 4 of his colleagues were arrested, tried and convicted by the Soviets and sentenced to 25 years in prison. After Profer's arrest, one of his bosses, Ludwig Topf, took his own life rather than face justice. It wasn't until 2014 that SNCF, the French railway company, paid $60 million in compensation to survivors living in the US for its part in transporting French Jews to the camps. Birkenau Commandant Rudolf Höss was a prosecution witness at the Nuremberg trials before being sent to Warsaw, where he was tried and convicted as a war criminal. He admitted, "I have sinned against humanity." He was hung at Auschwitz I, and the gallows left as a permanent symbol that some justice was served. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, chief architect of the Holocaust, was held in Israel in 1961 and was filmed and broadcast around the world. There is some small satisfaction in watching his squirming discomfiture during that trial, behind a bulletproof screen, as he faced his worst nightmare. He had not succeeded in murdering every Jew in Europe, and now there he was, captured by Jews, put on trial for murdering millions of Jews, questioned by Jewish lawyers and judges in the Jewish state of Israel. It took the judges over an hour to read out the total list of charges against him. He was found guilty on all counts, hung, and his ashes scattered without ceremony or dignity, condemned to the same disrespect he showed millions. It's estimated that 99% of those involved in murdering Jewish people during World War II were never brought to justice. In Krakow, a survivor of Płaszów recovered many of the pillaged tombstones from the camp and had them reinstalled at the new Jewish cemetery, alongside many cenotaphs and memorials to Jews murdered by the Nazis who were denied a proper burial. The Liban quarry complex, where many of them were worked or starved to death, still stands, and today, even amongst the rocks and rubble, keys, horseshoes and other items are found. Płaszów camp itself was completely destroyed and became a huge green space used by the residents of Podgórze for dog walking and picnics, many of whom must have been unaware that the remains of around 10,000 people lay beneath their feet. These people had been murdered, buried in mass graves, then, as depicted in Schindler's List, exhumed, burned, and their ashes scattered across the land. Almost inevitably, the site and how to commemorate the horrific events that took place there became mired in controversy. In 2020, plans for a museum were opposed by some nearby residents who were concerned about the effects that a large influx of tourists would have on an area which contains numerous large housing estates. However, the plans were approved, and the museum is scheduled to open in 2025. Of course, the biggest dilemma was what to do with the remains of Auschwitz-Birkenau. As a member of the Warsaw Culture Ministry once said, the Germans built the camp with the intention of exterminating an entire race and then destroying all evidence of this deed. Some of the Allies believed that the entire complex should be destroyed, but the restored Polish government decided it should be preserved. It treads an uneasy line between popular tourist attraction, memorial site and museum. It gets around 2 million visitors every year from all over the world. From the UK, you can have a 3-day all-inclusive city break to Krakow, which includes an optional 1-day guided tour to Auschwitz. Housed in what was the administration block is the Schindler Factory Museum, which not only commemorates him and the lives he saved, but also celebrates Jewish life in Krakow before 1939. This includes all the barbershop interior fittings, including original equipment, newspaper pages, posters and signs, used for over 50 years in the salon of Joseph Drabeck. The Hall of Choice has marble walls containing stories, quotations and short biographies in English, Polish and Hebrew of people who stood up against anti-Semitism, risking their own lives to save others. The Square of the Ghetto Heroes in Krakow was inaugurated in December 2005. It features 70 oversized steel chairs made by Peter Lewicki and Kazimiera Latak. One chair for every 1,000 Jewish people who once lived in the city, most of whom never returned. The chairs have more recently become a place of remembrance for others who may never return to their homes in Israel. Having suffered first under the brutal Nazi regime and then the brutal Soviet communist regime, it's hardly surprising that the Jewish population of Poland is now only around 30,000 people, and in Krakow itself about 800. Although the city's 7 synagogues survived, only one is in use. But despite the Nazis' best efforts, Jewish life and culture were not erased from the city. Kazimierz is once again the heart of the Jewish community, and now visited by thousands of tourists every year, as well as a place of celebration and commemoration for residents. Historic buildings have been restored and reopened. And what has changed since those fateful events? Well, my friends, the news is not good. On October 11th, 2024, sand bunkers at Hendon Golf Club were marked with anti-Semitic messages and symbols. The same month, ITV reporter Sam Holder visited Paris. France now has the biggest Jewish population in Europe. Holder found that many synagogues were guarded by armed police, that in Rouen, which has only 200 Jewish residents, a man threw a petrol bomb into the town's only synagogue. He also found that there were more anti-Semitic attacks in France between October and December 2023 than in the previous 3 years combined, and that 40% of French Jews were considering emigrating. Anita Lasker-Wolfisch, cellist in the Birkow Women's Orchestra, during a discussion about the Jews being called God's chosen people, said, "Only what for are we chosen? You know the famous Jewish prayer? Why don't you choose somebody else for a change? What have we done?" Today, a boy with a kippah on his head is not out of danger. So we haven't really made much progress yet. When asked by her daughter if she would go with her to visit Auschwitz, she declined. She said, "My Auschwitz is not your Auschwitz." And that is true for virtually all of the 2 million people who visit the site every year. But visiting my Auschwitz was the best and least I could do for the dead and the survivors. To bear witness to the public relics and examples of the world's most unbearable cruelty and bigotry. To face them, and to pay silent tribute to the victims whose mass graves I had no choice but to stand upon to do so, and to heed and highlight the warnings we had been given. In 2024, Hans-Jürgen Höss, son of the Auschwitz-Birkenau commandant, agreed to participate in Daniela Volker's documentary The Commandant's Shadow, to meet Anita Lasker-Wolfisch, and to visit Auschwitz-Birkenau for the first time. He was asked, "Is this what you imagined?" He replied, "No, this is unimaginable." He also said, "We can only hope this won't happen again somewhere, and that we've learnt from it. But I don't think we have. Otherwise there wouldn't be anti-Semitism again like there is now." And as Lawrence Rees wrote regarding the history of the Holocaust, it lies there, ugly, inert, waiting to be rediscovered by each new generation. A warning for us, and for those who will come after.